Get out of my house.
Colton Reyes froze in the doorway, one boot still on the porch, moonlight cutting a pale line across the dust-choked floor of a house he'd bought at auction 3 days ago. He hadn't expected furniture. He sure as hell hadn't expected a woman curled on a bare mattress in the corner, a rifle propped against the wall within easy reach of her hand, her eyes already open and locked on him like she'd been listening to his truck tires on the gravel for the last quarter mile. "This is my house," he said. "Bought it Tuesday." "Then you bought a lie." She sat up slow, the rifle rising with her, not quite pointed at him, but not far off either. Bank had no right selling it. Colton lifted both hands, palms out, the universal language of a man who owned 4 ranches across 2 states and had never once, in 34 years, had a gun leveled at him in his own doorway. It was almost funny. Almost. "I've got the deed in my truck," he said. "Signed, notarized, recorded at the county courthouse. I'm not looking for trouble, ma'am. I didn't know anybody was living here." "Nobody's supposed to be." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away first, which told him more than the rifle did. Her hair was dark and matted with sleep, her jaw sharp under skin gone thin the way it did when a person had been skipping meals on purpose, not by accident. A child's shoe sat by the mattress, small and scuffed, and Colton's stomach dropped an inch before he made himself not look at it twice. He'd flown in from Denver that afternoon in a helicopter that landed in the North Pasture, wearing a suit jacket he'd since thrown in the truck bed, because the ranch, Cottonwood Bend, 4,000 acres of Wyoming high country his grandfather used to run cattle on before the family sold off in pieces, had come up in a foreclosure auction, and Colton had bought it back on instinct alone. He hadn't told his lawyers why. He hadn't told anyone why. He'd just wired the money and driven out himself instead of sending a property manager, because some part of him wanted to stand on that land one more time before it belonged to strangers again. He hadn't planned on the land already belonging to someone. "How long have you been staying here?" he asked. "Long enough. There's no power, no water that I could see." He'd walked the place that morning. Dust sheeting off every surface, a hole in the roof over the kitchen big enough to watch clouds through, the barn out back leaning like a man drunk on his feet. Nothing about it said lived in, except now it did. "We manage." The rifle finally lowered an inch, which he understood to be the closest thing to a truce she was offering. "We." He looked at the shoe again, and this time she caught him looking, and something in her face went hard and protective all at once. A mother wolf deciding whether the man in her den was a threat worth dying over. "Is there a child here?" Colton kept his voice level, the same tone he used gentling a spooked colt, low and even and going nowhere fast. She didn't answer. Somewhere behind the half-collapsed wall that used to separate the kitchen from what had been a nursery 100 years back, a small cough sounded, thin and wet, the kind of cough that kept a person up nights worrying. "Ma'am," Colton said, and for the first time his voice wasn't steady at all. "How sick is that child?" The rifle came up again, but her hands were shaking now, and Colton understood in that moment that the gun wasn't for him. It had never really been for him. It was for every man who'd come before him with worse intentions. For a world that had chased a woman and a sick kid into a condemned house with a hole in the roof, and made her sleep with a rifle across her knees just to see morning. "You've got until sunrise to leave," she said. "After that, I don't care whose name is on the deed. I'll do what I have to." Colton Reyes, who had walked out of boardrooms worth 9 figures without breaking a sweat, stood in the doorway of his dead grandfather's house and understood, with a clarity that scared him more than the rifle did, that he wasn't going anywhere. Not at sunrise. Maybe not ever. "My name's Colton," he said quietly, "and I think we need to talk about that cough before either one of us worries about the deed." She stared at him a long moment, decades of caution warring with something closer to desperation, and outside the wind picked up, rattling the broken window glass like something trying to get in, or trying to get out. Her name was Marisol Vance, and she didn't give it up easily. It came out in pieces over the next hour, while Colton knelt by a rusted wood stove that hadn't seen a fire in who knew how long, and got one going with kindling he found stacked oddly neat against the wall, proof that whatever chaos had brought her here, she hadn't stopped fighting for order inside it. The boy's name was Eli, 6 years old, fevered, his breathing a thin whistle that made Colton's jaw tighten every time he heard it from the next room. "He needs a doctor," Colton said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." "I know what he needs." Marisol's voice had an edge on it, but her hands, wrapped around a tin cup of water he'd fetched from the truck, trembled hard enough to send ripples across the surface. "I don't have a truck. I don't have money for a doctor who won't ask questions I can't answer. And I'm not going back to town because the men looking for us are still there." "What men?" She looked at him like he'd asked her to hand over the last thing she owned. Maybe he had. "My husband's brother. He decided after the funeral that Eli belonged to him, that a woman alone couldn't raise a boy right, that the ranch he thinks I inherited should have gone to family blood, not to me. He's got money. He's got a lawyer. And 2 weeks ago, he sent men to take Eli while I was at the grocer's, and if I hadn't come back early—" She stopped. Didn't finish it. Didn't need to. Colton understood then why she was squatting in a condemned house with no power 40 miles from the nearest town, why the shoe by the mattress was small and scuffed and precious, why the rifle never left her side. "This isn't your family's ranch," he said carefully. "This was my grandfather's place, generations back. I don't know your husband's brother, but I know men like that. Money makes them patient. It doesn't make them right." "Doesn't matter if you're right when the sheriff's on his payroll." Marisol's jaw set. "I'll figure something else out. I always do." Here was the choice, the one Colton would turn over for years afterward. Not whether to help, because some decisions a man makes before he's finished making them, but how far. He could write a check. He could hire a lawyer, put the boy in a hospital, solve it the way he solved every other problem in his life, with capital and distance and other people's hands doing the difficult work while his stayed clean. Or he could do what his gut told him to do, which was get in his truck, right now, drive them both to the county hospital in Larkspur, and stand between whatever came next, himself. "Get his shoes," Colton said. "We're leaving. Now." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed, "you don't. But you know that cough, and you know what happens if it gets worse out here with no one but a rifle to help you. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me drive." Something in her face cracked then. Not surrender, never that, but a kind of desperate arithmetic, weighing the stranger against the fever, against the men who might already be circling back toward this house now that word had likely spread a rich man's helicopter had landed in the north pasture that afternoon. "If you're lying to me," she said, voice low and dangerous, "I'll put a bullet in you before I let anyone touch that boy." "Fair," Colton said, and meant it. She carried Eli out wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled of dust and wood smoke, the boy's small face slack with fever, his breath rattling audibly now in the cold night air. Colton laid the back seat flat with his own jacket for a pillow and drove the ranch road too fast for safety, headlights cutting across sage and stone. Marisol on the front seat with the rifle across her knees, watching the mirrors the entire way like she expected headlights to appear behind them at any moment. They did. 2 sets, distant but closing, cresting the ridge behind them just as the ranch turnoff disappeared from view. "They found us," Marisol said, and her voice had gone flat and cold, the voice of someone who'd run out of hope and located, underneath it, something harder and more useful. "Drive faster." Colton's foot found the floor. In the back seat, Eli coughed again, and somewhere behind them the second pair of headlights closed the distance with the patient, unhurried confidence of men who believed they already owned everything that mattered. The truck's engine screamed as Colton pushed it past what the ranch road was built to handle, gravel spitting from the tires, the headlights behind them holding steady in the mirror like a pair of patient eyes. "There's a turnoff a mile up," Marisol said, gripping the door handle. "Old logging road. They won't know it." "They'll know everything about this land if your husband's brother has been planning this for 2 weeks. Colton's knuckles had gone white on the wheel. In the back, Eli's breathing had gone from a whistle to something worse. Short, shallow pulls that scared Colton more than the trucks behind them did. They took the turn off anyway, because it was the only card left to play, the truck bucking over ruts that hadn't seen maintenance in a decade, branches clawing the windows on both sides. For nearly a minute, the headlights behind them vanished, swallowed by trees, and Colton allowed himself half a breath of hope. Then the lights reappeared, closer than before, and a third set joined them. "They split up," Marisol said. "They know these roads better than we do." "How far to Larkspur?" 20 minutes if we're lucky, less if you don't slow down for the wash crossing." Her voice was steady now, almost eerily so, a woman who'd rehearsed this flight 100 times in her mind, even if she'd never had to run it for real. It was flooded. Colton saw the water first as a black sheet across the headlights, moonlight skating off the surface, and behind him the pursuing trucks were close enough now that he could see their high beams jouncing against the tree line. "Hold on," he said, and didn't slow down. The truck hit the water at speed, sheeting spray across the windshield, the undercarriage grinding against submerged rock hard enough to rattle every bone in Colton's chest. And for one terrible second, the wheels lost the road entirely, and the whole truck slewed sideways toward the drop-off on the right, where the wash cut deep into the hillside. Marisol grabbed the dashboard. In the back seat, Eli cried out, a thin, frightened sound that cut through the roar of water and engine both. Then the tires caught gravel on the far bank, and the truck lurched forward and up, out of the water, fishtailing once before Colton wrestled it straight. Behind them, the first pursuing truck hit the crossing too fast and didn't have four-wheel drive built into a chassis worth more than most houses. Its headlights swung wildly as it hydroplaned sideways into the wash, engine dying with a sound like a slammed door. The second truck braked hard, swerving to avoid it, buying Colton and Marisol precious seconds. "Go, go, go!" Marisol was saying, not to Colton, but to the truck itself, to the night, to whatever god still owed her a favor. They broke out of the logging road onto the county highway, with the third truck still behind them, closer now, and Colton understood with cold clarity that this one wasn't going to lose them to a water crossing or bad luck. This driver knew what he was doing. The gap was closing, headlights washing bright through the rear window, close enough now that Colton could make out two silhouettes in the cab. "He's going to try to run us off the road," Marisol said. "He did it once before, 2 weeks ago. I only got away because I know this county and he doesn't." "Does he know it now?" "He's had 2 weeks to learn." Her hand found the rifle in the footwell, and Colton understood, with a lurch that had nothing to do with the road, that she meant to use it, to roll down the window at highway speed with a sick child in the back seat and take a shot at a moving target, because that was the last card in her hand, and she'd play it before she let anyone reach Eli. "Don't," Colton said. "Not yet. There's a sheriff's substation 18 miles up. Real one, county badge, not on anybody's payroll that I know of. If we can hold them off that long, 18 miles is a long time to hold off a man who wants my son." The truck behind them surged closer, its front bumper nearly kissing their tailgate, and Colton felt the impact before he heard it. A hard, deliberate jolt that sent the wheel wrenching in his hands, the whole truck shuddering as it fought the edge of the road and the black nothing of the ditch beyond. "Hold on to him," Colton shouted to Marisol, meaning Eli, meaning everything, and floored the accelerator into the dark with a stranger's life bleeding into the only decision that had ever mattered more to him than a boardroom, and the second impact came before he'd finished the thought. The truck didn't go into the ditch. That was the only mercy the night offered. Colton held the wheel through the second impact by main strength and stubbornness, tires screaming, and somehow kept all four wheels on the pavement long enough for headlights to appear ahead of them. Real headlights. A real vehicle. Coming the other direction with a light bar mounted on the roof, blue and red igniting the darkness like a flare. The pursuing truck peeled off into a side road before the deputy's lights ever reached them, gone into the dark as quick as it had appeared, and Colton pulled over onto the shoulder with his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the wheel to stop them. The deputy who approached the window turned out to be a woman near 60, with silver hair under her hat and no patience for nonsense. And by the time Colton finished explaining who he was, who Marisol was, and what had been chasing them down a county highway at 11 at night, she'd already radioed ahead to the hospital in Larkspur and requested backup to run down the truck's plates. It was past midnight by the time Eli was settled in a hospital bed, an IV drip in his small arm. The doctor's verdict, pneumonia. Serious, but caught in time. He'd recover with rest and antibiotics, finally letting the air back into Marisol's lungs for what looked like the first time in days. She sat in the plastic chair beside the bed with her son's hand in both of hers, and Colton stood in the doorway, not knowing whether he belonged in the room or not. a stranger who'd become, in the space of 6 hours, something neither of them had a word for yet. "You didn't have to do any of that," Marisol said, not looking up from Eli's face. "You could have handed me a check and a lawyer's number and gone back to whatever life you came from." I thought about it. He came and sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees. "For about 4 seconds, back at the house. Then I looked at that shoe by your mattress, and I thought about my grandfather, who built that ranch out of nothing and lost it because the world doesn't hand honest people breathing room. And I figured, I don't know. I figured a man doesn't get many chances in his life to be the reason things turn out different instead of the same." Marisol was quiet a long moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "My husband died 8 months ago. Horse accident, nothing anyone could have stopped. And within a week, his brother had lawyers telling me Eli would be better raised with family stability, meaning money, meaning a wife I wasn't. I've been running since March." "You shouldn't have had to run at all." "No." A small, exhausted laugh escaped her, more relief than humor. "I shouldn't have. But I did, and I got good at it. And I stopped believing anybody would step between me and the men who wanted to prove I couldn't do this alone." She reached into the collar of her shirt and pulled out a thin leather cord, a small carved wooden horse hanging from it, worn smooth by years of handling. "My husband carved this the week Eli was born. I've worn it every day since he died. I used to think it meant I was holding on to something that was already gone." "What do you think it means now?" "Ask me in the morning." But she smiled when she said it, small and real, the first smile he'd seen from her, and something loosened in Colton's chest that had been tight since the moment he'd walked into that ruined house and found a rifle pointed his way. "That house," he said after a while. "Cottonwood Bend. I bought it back because it used to belong to my family, and some sentimental part of me wanted to stand on the land one more time. I hadn't figured out what I'd do with it beyond that." "And now?" "Now I think it needs people in it who'll fight for it the way you fought for that boy tonight. It's got good bones under all that rot. Water rights, grazing land that hasn't been touched hard in 30 years. He met her eyes. "I'm not saying that to be smooth, Marisol. I'm saying it because I don't much want to fly back to Denver tomorrow and leave you and Eli to figure out the next chapter of a story that almost ended in a ditch tonight." She didn't answer right away. Outside the window, the first gray edge of dawn was creeping over the hospital parking lot, and somewhere down the hall a nurse's cart rattled past, and Eli, in his sleep, curled his small hand tighter around his mother's finger. "That man is still out there," Marisol said quietly. "He won't stop just because we got away tonight." "No," Colton agreed. "He won't. Which means tomorrow we stop running, and we make him the one who has to answer for what happened on that highway." It took 6 weeks, not one night, to finish what had started on that dark county highway. But it ended, in the end, in a courtroom instead of a ditch, which was its own kind of miracle. Colton hired lawyers, but not to write checks and disappear the way he might have once. He sat beside Marisol at every hearing. He testified about the trucks on the highway, the deliberate collision, the deputy's report, and the plates that traced back to men on the payroll of Garrett Vance, Marisol's brother-in-law, a man who'd built a small fortune in oil leases and believed, with the particular arrogance of people who'd never been told no, that money could simply outlast anyone's resistance. It couldn't outlast a highway patrol investigation, a hospital record proving a 6-year-old had nearly died of untreated pneumonia while fleeing armed pursuit, and a judge with no patience for men who sent hired trucks after grieving widows. Garrett's custody petition collapsed in a single afternoon. The vehicular assault charges took longer, but they came, and when they did, Marisol sat in the front row with Eli's small hand in hers and didn't flinch once.
"Scars mean it lived," she told Colton afterward, on the courthouse steps, the leather cord with the wooden horse still around her neck. "I used to think surviving something ugly just left you marked. Now I think the mark's proof you made it through." Cottonwood Bend took longer to heal than the legal fight did. Colton put contractors on the roof before winter, rebuilt the barn plank by plank with what he insisted on cutting himself on the weekends he flew in from Denver, and slowly, over that first year, the house stopped looking like a ruin and started looking like what it had once been, a place built to hold a family, patient enough to wait 100 years for the right ones to come find it. Eli recovered fully, the way children do, filling the ranch with the sound of boots running across floorboards that had been silent for a decade, learning to ride on a gentle mare Colton picked out himself, learning that a barn didn't have to be a place you hid in but could be a place you belonged. He started calling Colton by his first name, and then, one ordinary evening 8 months later, without any particular ceremony, started calling him something else instead, and nobody in that kitchen made a fuss about it, because some transformations didn't need announcing. They just settled into a house and stayed. Marisol never did become the woman who needed rescuing. She ran the ranch's books herself within the year, argued Colton down on 3 separate business decisions and won 2 of them, and wore the rifle less because she needed it and more, Colton thought, because it had become part of who she was, a woman who'd learned to protect what mattered and never quite unlearned the habit, even once the danger had passed. They married the following autumn, on the porch of the house where a stranger had once found a woman asleep with a gun across her knees, guarding a sleeping boy against a world that hadn't given either of them much reason to trust it. There were no cameras, no helicopters, nothing that spoke to the fortune Colton still quietly managed from an office in town 3 days a week. Just the 2 of them, Eli standing between them in a small borrowed suit, and a preacher from Larkspur who'd married half the county over 40 years and said he'd never seen 2 people look so much like they'd already survived the hard part before the vows even started. Years later, when Eli was grown and had children of his own running barefoot across the same pasture where a helicopter once landed on a Tuesday afternoon, he'd tell the story the way it had been told to him, not as a rescue, though it had felt like one that first terrible night, but as 2 people who'd both been running from something and happened, by grace or luck or the particular mercy of a ruined house on forgotten land, to stop running in the same place at the same time. The wooden horse still hung from its leather cord, passed down eventually to Eli's own daughter, worn smoother every year by hands that carried a story instead of letting it go. And on quiet evenings, when the light went gold over Cottonwood Bend and the cattle moved slow across the ridge the way they had for generations, anyone driving the county road past the old gate could still see 2 figures on the porch, unhurried, home, the kind of image that doesn't need a caption, because some stories, once they finally stop running, simply become a place where a family lives,